The year was 1095. Europe was cold, divided and desperate for salvation. From crumbling castles to starving villages, people whispered of sin, damnation, and the fires of hell. And in that darkness, one voice promised redemption, Pope Urban II, calling for a holy war unlike any before. When his words thundered across the Council of Clermont, Deus vult, God wills it, they ignited a storm that would consume 2 centuries. The First Crusade had begun. Knights, peasants, thieves, and kings all took up the cross, marching toward a land none of them truly understood. Jerusalem, the holy city, believed to be the center of the world. Those who went seeking heaven often found hell. The Crusades were drenched in faith and blood, a pilgrimage armed with swords. By 1099, Jerusalem was taken in a flood of violence so brutal that even chroniclers of the time struggled to describe it. Blood ran through the streets to the knees of horses. The Crusaders believed they had done God's will, yet what they left behind was not peace, but chaos, a holy land, surrounded by enemies and haunted by vengeance. In the aftermath, pilgrims flooded toward Jerusalem to see the land their Savior had walked, but few ever returned. Bandits, desert raiders, and assassins made the roads deadly. The journey to Christ's tomb became a march through death. It was in this perilous aftermath that a small group of knights swore an oath, not for glory, not for conquest, but for protection. They vowed to guard the pilgrims traveling through the Holy Land, even if it meant their own death. Their leader was Hugues de Payens, a French knight of noble birth but humble faith. Alongside 8 companions, he formed an order unlike any the world had ever seen. Pauperes, Commilitones, Christi Templici, Salomonici, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The year was 1119, and from those 9 men, the Knights Templar were born. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They owned nothing. They wore simple white mantles, marked by a red cross, a symbol of martyrdom and sacrifice. Their home was the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, believed to stand where the ancient Temple of Solomon once rose sacred ground, now echoing with the prayers of warriors. In the silence of their quarters, surrounded by relics and sand, they prayed. But when they rode out, they became something else entirely, warriors of God, bound by faith, forged by discipline, and feared by all who opposed them. To the pilgrims, they were angels of protection. To their enemies, they were demons in white. Their reputation spread across continents, men who never fled, who fought to the death, whose courage seemed supernatural. And behind their valor, something darker began to grow power. Their fame reached the highest throne of Christendom. In 1129, the Church formally recognized the order at the Council of Troy, with the blessing of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most powerful clerics of his time. Bernard called them Knights of Christ, divine warriors who turned faith into steel. His writings became their gospel, painting them as the perfect fusion of monk and soldier. The Templars were no longer a handful of knights, they were a holy army. Europe poured its wealth into their cause. Nobles donated land, kings offered privileges, and men seeking absolution joined their ranks. The Templar banner, a black field above, white below, symbolizing death and purity, became a flag of terror to their enemies and of salvation to their allies. But their discipline was unlike any other. Each Templar knight lived under a rigid rule. No laughter, no luxury, no contact with women, no adornment, no fear. They dined in silence, prayed 7 times a day, and trained relentlessly. Their horses were as precious as relics, their swords consecrated before battle. Even in victory they could not boast. Even in pain they could not cry out. They were, as one chronicler wrote, living martyrs, men who died daily for Christ. And die they did. In the scorching deserts of Palestine, they rode into impossible battles against Saracen armies, often outnumbered 10 to 1. Their charge was legendary, a silent, thundering wall of steel, advancing with the calm of prayer and the certainty of death. The Templars began to change the very idea of warfare. They introduced discipline, hierarchy, and logistics unknown to Europe's feudal armies. They built fortresses across the Holy Land, impenetrable strongholds carved into rock and sand. From Safed to Acre, from Tortosa to Gaza, their castles became symbols of faith and defiance. But faith was only part of their strength. As the decades passed, the order began to manage money first for pilgrims, then for kings. A man could deposit wealth in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem, safeguarded by the Templars' code and seal. They had created something astonishing, an early form of banking. From vows of poverty, they had risen to control riches beyond imagination. From protectors, they had become power brokers. Yet in their rise lay the seed of their doom. For where power grows, envy follows. And though the Templars believed they served only God, others began to see them as rivals, even threats. But for now, they were untouchable. Holy knights who fought without fear, monks who wielded swords like relics, a brotherhood that seemed to stand above kings and priests alike. And as the sun set over Jerusalem, its light glinting on their white mantles and blood-red crosses, few could have imagined that these same knights, these paragons of faith, would one day be burned as heretics. The fire had not yet begun, but the fuel was already being gathered. The fire had not yet begun, but the fuel was already being gathered. And while the embers of their destiny smoldered unseen, the Templars themselves were building something eternal. Their white mantles shone under the desert sun as they rode through the Holy Land, no longer 9 men bound by oath, but hundreds, disciplined and unyielding. They were no longer simply knights. They were a living rule. Every action was worship, every battle a prayer. To live as a Templar was to be reborn. They rose before dawn, chanting psalms in cold stone chapels. They ate in silence beneath the watchful cross, never speaking unless prayer required it. Their meals were plain bread, beans, water. Their laughter was sin, their comfort temptation. Even their armor was consecrated, for to ride into battle was to walk upon holy ground. They called themselves Milites Christi, the soldiers of Christ. But the world called them something else, the warrior monks. Unlike any army before them, the Templars answered not to kings or crowns, but to God alone. Their Grand Master stood equal to princes, yet he slept upon straw. Each brother carried both sword and rosary, ready to kill or to die without hesitation. Discipline defined them. If one knight fled the field, the entire company could be punished. If one showed fear, he might lose not only his honor, but his soul. Their tactics terrified enemies and allies alike. When others charged in chaos, the Templars advanced in silence, rows of white crosses gliding forward like a wave of death. They fought not for plunder or fame, but because they believed the blood they spilled was the will of heaven itself. Even death was victory. For them, the battlefield was the altar, and their bodies were the sacrifice. At first, their courage seemed madness. Eyewitnesses told of Templar knights who rode into overwhelming odds and never turned back. Their reputation grew with each battle. To the Saracen chroniclers, they were mad dogs of God, men who feared neither sword nor fire. To fellow Crusaders, they were both inspiration and warning, a reminder that holiness, when weaponized, could become something monstrous. As the years passed, the order's structure hardened. Ranks emerged, knights, sergeants, chaplains and servants. Each had his duty, each served in silence. They built fortresses that defied the ages, stone giants like Crac de Chevalier, Belvoir and Tortosa. From their ramparts, black banners rippled in the wind, each marked with the Red Cross, a symbol not only of salvation but of sacrifice. The desert winds carried the chant of prayers, mingled with the clang of steel. The Templars became the beating heart of the Crusader states. They garrisoned castles, guarded trade routes, and stood as the final wall between the Christian kingdoms and the Saracen tide. Kings sought their counsel, merchants trusted their gold. They were both sword and shield to Christendom. And yet, beneath their vow of poverty, wealth began to flow like a hidden river. It started innocently. Pilgrims needed protection not just for their lives, but for their belongings. The Templars devised a system. A pilgrim could deposit money in one commandery in Europe and withdraw it safely in Jerusalem. Each deposit was recorded, sealed with the Templar cross. In this simple act, the Knights Templar invented something the world had never truly seen before: international banking. Soon, their network stretched from the British Isles to the sands of Palestine. They owned fleets, farms, estates, and mines. Their fortresses became both barracks and treasuries. Even monarchs turned to them for loans. Kings who once ruled them now owed them. And with each transaction, the Templars grew more powerful, more secretive, more untouchable. But with power came suspicion. Whispers stirred in courts and cathedrals. How could men sworn to poverty wield such wealth? How could monks who spoke little and prayed much command armies larger than nations? Some said they had uncovered hidden relics beneath Solomon's temple, artifacts of divine or blasphemous power. Others whispered of secret rituals, of midnight oaths taken in silence, of forbidden knowledge passed from master to novice. The truth was likely far simpler, but in a world ruled by faith, rumors of heresy were more dangerous than swords. The Templars' devotion set them apart, and what sets men apart is often what dooms them. Yet in these years, none of that mattered. Their star was still rising, and the light of that star blinded even the church that blessed them. By the mid-12th century, the Templars had become a force few dared to challenge. They rode beside kings into battle, and kings knelt before them in debt. Their seal, a knight and his brother sharing a single horse, symbolized humility, but it also hinted at a deeper truth. The Templars were two things at once: sacred and profane, poor and powerful, holy and ruthless. On the battlefield, they were terrifyingly efficient. Templar rule forbade retreat unless outnumbered 3 to 1, and even then, only with permission. When their banner fell, every knight was expected to die where he stood. Chronicles describe how their formation stood like walls against waves of Saracen cavalry, how they would ride straight through enemy ranks and reform as if death could not touch them. To enemies, they seemed inhuman. To allies, they seemed invincible. And yet within their discipline, cracks were forming. The line between faith and fanaticism blurred. When Jerusalem fell in 1187 to Saladin, the Templars fought with unmatched fury, but their defeat broke something sacred. They withdrew to coastal strongholds, licking wounds not just of flesh but of faith. The Holy Land they had sworn to protect was lost, and with it, a piece of their soul. Still, they endured. They returned to Europe, bringing with them the wealth, knowledge, and scars of 100 years of holy war. And in the silence of their commanderies, far from the desert sun, the Templars began to change. Their prayers grew quieter, their rituals more secret, their power more political. They were no longer merely guardians of pilgrims, they were guardians of kings. And when the world would no longer need their swords, it would begin to covet their gold. The Templars' legend was written not just in scripture and stone, but in blood and fear. They had risen from nothing but faith and fire. Now their empire of crosses stretched across continents, invisible yet undeniable. And in the echoing halls of their fortresses, where monks once prayed and soldiers once bled, one question began to whisper through the centuries. When a warrior serves both God and gold, which master does he obey? When a warrior serves both God and gold, which master does he obey? That question lingered like a shadow over the order, as the years turned from conquest to control. By the dawn of the 13th century, the Knights Templar were no longer simply the sword of Christendom, they were its vault, its treasury, its quiet, calculating heart. The battlefield had changed. The deserts of the Holy Land gave way to marble halls and counting tables. Their swords still gleamed, but now beside ledgers, seals, and parchments bearing royal crests. The Templars had become the bankers of God. It began, as all empires do, with necessity. Pilgrims and nobles alike needed safety not only for their lives, but for their fortunes. Traveling to Jerusalem was perilous. Thieves lurked in every valley and pirates haunted the seas. The order offered a divine solution. Deposit your wealth in one Templar commandery, and you could withdraw it in another, sealed under the cross. It was the first network of international banking, the first trust system in a world of suspicion and blood. Templar documents were recognized across kingdoms. Their sealed 2 knights riding a single horse became the symbol of incorruptible honor. At first it was charity, then it became service, and soon it became power. From their strongholds, the Templars began lending to kings. The order's reach stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the deserts of Egypt. They owned farms in England, vineyards in France, silver mines in Spain, and fleets that crossed the Mediterranean. In Paris stood the beating heart of this empire, the Templar Temple, a fortress so immense and secure that kings entrusted it with their crowns. Within its walls, vaults held not only gold, but secrets, letters, oaths, confessions, the currency of power. Kings borrowed from them to wage wars. Popes leaned on them to sustain crusades. The Templars became indispensable, and that made them dangerous. Their ledgers grew fatter than royal treasuries. Their word carried more weight than papal decrees. When they rode, banners of blood and faith still waved, but behind those banners now lay vaults of silver. For an order sworn to poverty, their wealth was unimaginable. But beneath the chants of monks and the clang of coins, envy was growing. Europe's nobility, once their patrons, began to whisper, "How can holy men be richer than kings? How can warriors of God own more land than the church itself?" Even their allies began to fear them. The Templars answered to no earthly power, only to the Pope. No king could command them, no bishop could tax them. Their fortresses were scattered across Europe like thorns, untouchable, self-sufficient, and loyal to no one but their own Grand Master. Whispers turned into legends. Some said the Templars had found the Ark of the Covenant, buried beneath Solomon's temple. Others believed they had unearthed the Holy Grail, the bloodline of Christ himself. To the faithful, they were keepers of divine relics. To the fearful, they were sorcerers hiding heresy beneath their holy vows. But within the order, there was no laughter, no drunkenness, no indulgence. They lived by a code carved from stone. Each knight owned only 3 horses, a single servant, and 1 set of clothes. When they died, nothing they possessed belonged to their families. It all returned to the order. And yet, though their personal poverty remained, the collective wealth of the Templars surpassed imagination. Their commanderies were miniature kingdoms. Their fleet, moored at La Rochelle, carried goods across continents. Even the King of England, Henry III, once deposited his jewels in their safekeeping. The Templars had become the spine of European finance. They funded crusades. They stored taxes. They handled the dowries of queens and the debts of emperors. When King Louis VII of France went to the Second Crusade, it was the Templars who managed his money. When Richard the Lionheart was captured, it was the Templars who ransomed his freedom. The soldiers of God had become the treasurers of kings, but the more they gave, the more the world wanted. And when gold flows from a single well, every thirsty hand turns toward it. In the year 1300, the Templars were at their zenith. They held over 9,000 estates, their network woven tighter than the veins of the church. Yet their purpose had shifted. The Holy Land was lost. Jerusalem had fallen more than a century before. The Crusades were dying, and with them the justification for the Templars' existence. No longer knights defending pilgrims, they had become bankers defending balance sheets. And in a Europe ruled by greed and fear, that was a far more dangerous profession. At the head of this empire stood Jacques de Molay, the 23rd Grand Master. He was a man of iron faith and quiet resolve, respected but wary. He saw the growing tension, the jealousy in the eyes of kings. None burned brighter or darker than that of King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. Philip was handsome, ruthless, and perpetually in debt. His wars against England and Flanders had emptied his treasury. His taxes had angered the church. His people whispered that he was cursed by his greed, and within his reach stood the Templar temple in Paris, filled with the gold he could not touch. At first, he borrowed politely. Then, he demanded. When the Templars refused to serve as his personal bankers, Philip's admiration turned to hatred. The same cross that once symbolized their holiness now marked them as prey. But Philip was not a fool. To destroy the Templars outright would be to provoke the church. He needed more than soldiers. He needed a weapon made of rumor, heresy, and fear. And so began the whisper campaign that would one day light the pyres. Still, in these final golden years, the Templars remained blind to their danger. They believed their service and sanctity would protect them, They trusted their vows, their pope, their god. They continued to meet in solemn ritual. In candlelit halls, they prayed in Latin chants that echoed like thunder. Their symbols, the double cross, the skull, the seal of two riders adorned banners fluttering in the evening wind. To them, each ritual was holy. To their enemies, it looked like blasphemy. Stories spread that Templars spat on the cross during initiation, that they worshipped a mysterious idol, that they denied Christ and kissed each other's feet in secret oaths. The truth of these claims would vanish in the fires that followed, but the damage had already begun. The order that had built Europe's wealth was now being accused of betraying heaven itself. And yet, on the surface, the Templars remained calm. Their commanderies thrived, their trade routes pulsed with life, and their vaults brimmed with coin. But in the shadows of Paris, a king was sharpening his knives. Philip's spies recorded the locations of Templar strongholds. His clerics whispered of their heresies to the Pope. His soldiers waited in silence. The year was 1307, and as the sun set over France, the golden age of the Templars darkened. They had begun as protectors of pilgrims. They became warriors of faith, then masters of gold. But the world they had built, one of wealth, secrecy, and power, was not the world of God. It was the world of men. And men, as history has always shown, will burn whatever they envy. The year was 1307, and across France the winds of autumn carried an unease that few could name. In the streets of Paris, merchants spoke in whispers. In the great halls of the Templar temple, gold gleamed under torchlight, unaware of the storm about to break. The Knights Templar still believed themselves untouchable. For nearly 2 centuries, they had stood as the guardians of Christendom, the sword of faith, the vault of kings, the conscience of popes. But power, once admired, always breeds resentment. Philip's face was carved from marble and pride, his eyes cold as steel. He saw himself as the hand of God, chosen to rule over men, yet beneath the golden crown lay a mountain of debt. His wars had drained his treasury, his enemies mocked his greed, and even the Pope, Boniface VIII, had dared to defy him. Philip crushed Boniface in fury, replacing him with Clement V, a Frenchman he could control. Yet even that victory was hollow, for the king's coffers were empty and the Templars those monks with sword. Philip's hatred did not blaze in daylight, but grew in shadow. His spies infiltrated Parisian taverns and monasteries, gathering whispers like dry twigs for a pyre. The Templars, they said, mock the cross in secret. They spit upon it. They deny Christ. They worship an idol called Baphomet. At first, it was rumor absurd, blasphemous, laughable. But Philip understood something the Templars did not. In a world ruled by faith, truth mattered less than fear. By the chill dawn of Friday, October 13, 1307, the trap was ready. Across France, church bells rang not for prayer, but for capture. Templar commanderies awoke to the pounding of fists and the clash of armor. Soldiers poured through iron gates, banners bearing the lily of France replacing the cross of the temple. Men who had fought at Jerusalem and Acre were dragged from their beds, bound in chains and accused of the unthinkable. The king's orders were absolute: arrest every Templar in France. What followed was not justice, but spectacle. The inquisitors, acting in the king's name, tortured the Templars with unspeakable cruelty. Men were stretched on racks, their limbs torn from sockets. Iron boots crushed their legs, flames licked their flesh, and screams echoed through stone corridors once meant for prayer. And under such agony, words began to spill, not truth but survival. Yes, they gasped, we denied Christ. Yes, we spat upon the cross. Yes, we worshipped an idol. Confession sign. Pope Clement V, bound by loyalty and fear, hesitated. The Church had birthed the Templars. To condemn them was to condemn itself. But Philip's reach extended even to Avignon. He sent emissaries with boxes of proof confessions extracted under torment, lists of heresies signed by trembling hands. The Pope, surrounded by French power, bowed. A papal bull was issued, Pastoralis Praeeminentiae, ordering all Christian monarchs to arrest Templars in their lands. The flames of accusation spread across Europe. Years of imprisonment followed. Trials dragged on, filled with contradictions and cruelty. Those who recanted their forced confessions were burned alive as relapsed heretics. Those who remained silent starved in their cells. Among them was Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars. Imprisoned for 7 years, he endured torture, humiliation, and betrayal. Yet when summoned before his accusers, his voice did not tremble. "I am guilty," he said, "only of defending the faith too fiercely." On one, Templar prelates recanted and begged mercy. On the other, stood Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay, his loyal companion. As flames licked their robes, Molay raised his shackled hands toward the sky. "God knows who is wrong and has sinned," he cried. "Soon, those who have condemned us will face his judgment. King Philip, Pope Clement, before the year is out, I summon you to stand before God's tribunal." The fire roared, devouring flesh and cloth, and the curse was born. History remembers war, coincidence or curse none could say. But the world had learned one lesson: when the righteous are burned, their ashes never stay silent. The Templar order was dissolved, their lands seized, their symbols erased. Yet their legend endured, whispered in taverns and monasteries, carried across seas and centuries. Some said the Templars fled to Scotland, taking their treasures and knowledge with them. Others claimed they became the Freemasons, guarding their secrets in new brotherhoods. And in quiet corners, they had risen from faith, ruled through gold, and fallen to envy. But the curse of Jacques de Molay still echoes through history, a warning carved not in stone or scripture, but in fire. Because in every age there will always be a king who covets power, a church that bows to fear, and a brotherhood that dares to serve only God. And for such men, the fire is never truly extinguished. The smoke still clung to the skies above Paris, a black halo over a kingdom that had just silenced its most loyal warriors. On the banks of the Seine, the ashes of Jacques de Molay drifted with the wind, tiny glowing embers that refused to die. To the people, it was the end of the Templars. To history, it was the beginning of a curse. When Molay's voice rang out through the flames, those who heard it never forgot. His words were not a plea for mercy, but a summons, a final trial before God himself. "Before the year is out," he had cried, "I summon you, King Philip and Pope Clement, to stand before God's tribunal." His flesh burned, but his eyes, witnesses said, never looked away from the horizon. And as the fire consumed him, something else was born, a sense that justice would not be written by kings, but by fate. In the weeks that followed, strange whispers spread through France. Sailors on the Seine claimed they saw the ghost of a knight walking the bridge at night, his armor glowing red like molten iron. Peasants swore they heard voices chanting near the ruins of Templar commanderies. Even nobles who had applauded the arrests began to speak the curse in hushed tones, afraid to say the Grand Master's name aloud. At first, King Philip dismissed it as superstition. He had done what he must, or so he told himself. The Templars were finished, their gold seized, their enemies silenced. France was his again. But in April of 1314, just 1 month after Molay's execution, Pope Clement V fell ill. His body swelled and blackened with a disease that no physician could name. He died gasping for air, the papal court trembling in fear. Before the year was done, Philip himself met his end. During a hunt, his horse suddenly reared and threw him against a tree. The king's spine shattered. He died days later, screaming in pain. Those who attended him swore that as he breathed his last, the sky over Fontainebleau darkened unnaturally, and the church bells rang on their own. Within a single year, both the Pope and the King, those who had condemned the Templars, were gone. The curse of Jacques de Molay had come to pass. But the vengeance of the flames did not end there. Philip's sons, who inherited his crown, all met untimely deaths, each without a male heir. The Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for over 300 years, collapsed within a single generation. Chroniclers called it La Malédiction des Templiers, the Templars' curse, and across Europe, the legend grew. In monasteries and markets, men whispered that God himself had avenged the order. Others claimed darker forces were at work, that the Templars had never truly died, but had slipped into the shadows, carrying their relics, their gold, and their vengeance across the seas. There were stories of Templar ships leaving the port of La Rochelle on the very night of their arrest, sailing west into the unknown. Some said they reached Scotland, where Robert the Bruce, excommunicated by the Pope, gave them sanctuary. Others believed they became something more, a secret brotherhood that would resurface centuries later, under new names and new symbols. Whatever the truth, one fact could not be denied. Though the fires had burned their flesh, the Templars had become immortal in legend. Even the Church could not escape its shadow. Clement's successor, Pope John XXIII, avoided France altogether, choosing to remain in Avignon behind fortified walls. His letters trembled with fear of heresy and betrayal. The Church had silenced the Templars, but in doing so, it had opened a wound in its own soul, a wound that would never truly heal. The Order's surviving brothers were scattered, broken, or absorbed into other knightly institutions. In Portugal, they became the Order of Christ. In Spain, the Order of Montesa. Each bore different names, but carried the same blood oath: to serve God above all kings. Centuries later, when explorers sailed beyond the edge of the known world, some would bear crosses eerily similar to the red sigil of the Templars. Coincidence? Or the ghost of an ancient brotherhood guiding the hand of destiny? But for those who had seen the flames firsthand, there was no mystery, only guilt. One chronicler wrote, "I saw the Grand Master die, and I saw the king's face pale when word came of his own doom. It was as though the fire that burned the Templars had reached into his very heart." And perhaps it had. For as the years passed, the story of Molay's final moments grew ever more vivid. Some claimed that as he burned, the Seine's waters boiled. Others said that an unseen wind carried his voice through the city, echoing off church towers. Cursed be those who wronged the innocent. Even now, 7 centuries later, the death of Jacques de Molay still marks a crossroads in European history. His execution was not merely the end of a knightly order, it was the death of an age. The Templars had been the last embodiment of faith unbroken by corruption, of courage sanctified by conviction. When they fell, something fundamental within Christendom cracked. The unity between sword and altar, the belief that God and power could coexist, turned to dust. In its place rose a colder, more cynical world, one ruled not by faith, but by fear and finance. The Church, though victorious, emerged diminished. Its alliance with kings had cost it its moral authority. And Europe, bereft of its holy warriors, began its slow descent into the shadows of doubt that would one day birth the Renaissance and the questioning of all that had once been sacred. But legend has a way of surviving where history cannot. In the ruins of old fortresses, beneath layers of dust and ivy, archaeologists have found strange carvings, crosses, coded initials, and stars aligning with constellations known only to navigators of the high seas. As the embers of their pyres faded, so too did the certainty of an age. The king who had sought to own God's gold lay dead. The Pope, who had betrayed his own knights, was reduced to dust, and the brotherhood that had once guarded the Holy Land now lived only in whispers. But every curse, as the ancients said, is also a prophecy. And so long as men crave power more than purity, and crowns weigh heavier than conscience, the flames that consume Jacques de Molay will never truly go out. They will burn quietly in stories, in symbols, in the hearts of those who remember. And in the darkness between faith and ambition, the shadow of the Templars still walks. The fires had gone out, but their light never truly faded. Centuries after the ashes of Jacques de Molay scattered into the wind, whispers of the Templars continued to haunt Europe. Their castles, though abandoned, seemed to breathe in the silence of the night. In their stone walls, symbols of crosses and coded stars lingered, signs no one could fully decipher. It was as if the Templars had vanished from the eyes of men, but not from the soul of history. After the fall, Europe should have moved on. But it didn't. Questions remained, like ghosts left behind after a storm. Where did the Templar fleets go that fateful night from La Rochelle? Who carried the sealed documents of the Grand Master? And why did some royal accountants record gold that no one ever saw again? In the ruins of their temples, monks discovered strange carvings, ships beneath stars, a red cross over waves, and figures kneeling before a sun that never set. It was as though the Templars had foreseen their downfall and prepared for a rebirth beyond the reach of kings. In Portugal, King Denis refused to burn the surviving knights. Instead, he rebranded them under a new name, the Order of Christ. Their oath was the same. Their mission was the same. Only their flag changed. Beneath it, Portuguese explorers would later sail into the unknown oceans, guided by stars that seemed older than Christendom itself. Vasco da Gama, Henry the Navigator all carried insignias eerily reminiscent of the Templar cross. Coincidence, perhaps, but perhaps not. In Scotland, the legend took a darker turn. When Robert the Bruce was excommunicated by the Pope, it was said he offered sanctuary to fugitive Templars who had escaped France. They arrived with gold, weapons, and secrets. And on a fog-soaked morning in 1314, when Bruce faced the English at Bannockburn, witnesses claimed to see a mysterious cavalry cloaked riders bearing the Red Cross charging through the mist. No one knew who they were, but after the battle, Scotland was free. Over the centuries, the Templar name faded from official records, but not from memory. Their symbols began to reappear in guild halls, cathedrals, and secret lodges across Europe. A new brotherhood began to rise in their shadow, the Freemasons. By the 17th century, Masonic lodges spoke of sacred geometry, hidden wisdom, and the architecture of the divine. Their rituals echoed the initiation rites of the Templars. Their emblems, compasses, squares, and stars hinted at the same cosmic knowledge that had guided the Knight monks of Jerusalem. Some said the Freemasons were the true heirs of the Templars, inheritors of their mission to build a kingdom of reason and enlightenment, rather than swords and crusades. Others believed they were the same brotherhood, reborn under new symbols, their oaths and secrets preserved through centuries of silence. The idea that the Templars had transcended death fascinated kings, scholars, and heretics alike. Napoleon, during his campaigns, ordered the excavation of ancient Templar sites. When he found strange geometric markings beneath the temple ruins in Paris, he had them sealed and marked, "For the Emperor's eyes only." Even he, a man who defied both Pope and monarch, seemed to fear the shadow of the Red Cross. In the 19th century, as Europe rediscovered its medieval roots, artists and occultists revived the myth. They painted the Templars as both martyrs and magicians' knights who had tasted divine truth and been punished for it. Some claimed that alchemists of the Renaissance had been guided by old Templar manuscripts, that the formula for transmutation was a secret passed down from those who once guarded the Temple Mount. The Church dismissed these stories as blasphemy. Yet even within its walls, quiet unease grew. Too many coincidences, too many symbols carved into ancient stones. The cross pate, the all-seeing eye, the sacred number 13 continued to appear where the Templars had once walked. And then came the modern age, an era of revolutions, science, and reason. Yet even as cathedrals gave way to factories, the myth of the Templars adapted. They were no longer the knights of the sword, but the architects of invisible empires, the whisper behind monarchies, banks, and secret councils. From that point forward, the Templars became more than history, they became myth incarnate. Secret societies claimed their heritage. The Rosicrucians, the Illuminati, even the skull and bones of Yale University drew on their imagery. The Red Cross, once a mark of faith, became a symbol of hidden power. But what is truth and what is legend? That question lingers still. Some historians believe that after the fall, fragments of Templar archives survived scrolls written in secret ciphers, smuggled out of France before the arrests. Others claim those documents formed the foundation of later revolutionary philosophies: liberty, equality, and brotherhood, the spiritual descendants of the Templar ideal. In dusty cathedrals from Spain to Scotland, strange carvings tell stories the Church never sanctioned a knight kneeling before a chalice, a serpent coiled around a cross, a star placed exactly where Jerusalem should lie. Each one a message, perhaps, left for those who still remember. In the modern age of satellites and screens, their mystery continues to inspire those who seek truth in the unseen. The Templars remind us that every age has its brotherhood, men and women who walk between faith and knowledge, between light and shadow. And so their legacy endures not just in myth, but in us. Every time we question power, every time we search for truth beneath deception, we carry a spark of the same defiance that burned on that pyre in Paris. For the fire of Jacques de Molay was not extinguished. It was inherited, and its light still flickers in secret halls, in whispered oaths, and in the restless hearts of those who refuse to bow to the tyranny of fear. The centuries passed, yet the name lingered, whispered in monasteries, carved into stone, hidden in the margins of forbidden books. The Knights Templar, once flesh and blood, had become something more. They were no longer bound by their vows or their fortresses. They had become an idea, a shadow that moved through history, unseen but always felt. Across Europe, empires rose and fell. The world changed, kings became presidents, cathedrals gave way to skyscrapers, swords turned into steel and circuitry. But through every transformation, one thing remained constant: power still gathered in secret. And wherever power hid, so too did the echo of the Templars. Their legacy was no longer measured in armies or treasure. It lived in symbols. The Red Cross reborn as emblems of medicine, charity and courage, the circle and triangle woven into architecture and currency, the unblinking eye watching over nations that prided themselves on freedom. Even as the church that destroyed them aged into silence, the Templar myth grew younger, sharper, more alive. Some said their bloodline continued through nobility, that certain families still carried the secret of the Grail, not as a cup, but as a code of divine knowledge. Others believed their descendants became the architects of modern faith and finance, the very powers that now govern the world in daylight. The truth is more elusive, because perhaps the Templars never intended to be resurrected as men. Perhaps they intended to live on as influence, an immortal force, guiding humanity's hunger for discovery and control. In the 15th century, explorers crossed oceans using navigation methods rooted in the Templars' secret star maps. In the 18th century, revolutionaries built nations on ideals of brotherhood, liberty, and equality, echoes of the Templar creed, twisted into politics. And in the 21st century, the pattern persists. Corporations bear crosses in their logos. Philanthropic orders adopt their oaths of secrecy. Even digital movements, anonymous and unseen, speak in the language of rebellion against tyranny, a cause the Templars themselves would have known well. If the order truly perished, its ghost learned to adapt. For in every age, new Templars are born not by an oath of the sword, but by the silent conviction that truth belongs to no king, and that power unchecked must be confronted. But history is not so kind to idealists. The Templars had learned that lesson through fire. Their pursuit of purity became the seed of their destruction. They believed they could serve both God and order, but those two masters were never meant to coexist. And so the cycle repeated: faith turned to corruption, secrecy to suspicion, knowledge to heresy. Even today, secret brotherhoods face the same curse. Whether they build temples of stone or towers of glass, they all inherit the same paradox: to wield truth without becoming tyrants. It is a balance no man or order has ever truly mastered. Perhaps that is why the legend refuses to die, because deep down humanity still longs for a brotherhood pure enough to hold the world accountable, to guard what is sacred when no one else will. In the catacombs beneath Paris, archaeologists once found an inscription carved into a wall sealed for 600 years. It read only 3 words: non omnis moriar, I shall not wholly die. No record proves it belonged to a Templar. And yet, who else would write it? Those words became prophecy. The Templars' ashes may have cooled, but their idea that unity and faith could transcend death became eternal. When Jacques de Molay burned, he did not leave behind gold or scripture. He left something far more dangerous: inspiration. The idea that men could create a world where faith served truth, not politics. That men could be warriors and mystics, builders and believers. That dream could never be killed, only buried. And every time humanity digs, it finds the Templars waiting not as ghosts, but as mirrors. Modern conspiracy theorists claim the Brotherhood still meets not in cathedrals, but in boardrooms. That decisions shaping the future are made not in parliaments, but in private rituals, illuminated by the faint red glow of a cross unseen by the masses. Are these the Templars reborn? Or are they the opposite proof that every age corrupts its saviors? We can never know. The Templar legacy is not a map that leads to a treasure, it's a mirror that asks a question. If you were given power over truth itself, what would you do with it? That is the real test of Brotherhood and perhaps the real curse of the Templars. Still, the evidence endures. Beneath old churches, symbols align perfectly with celestial coordinates. In sealed archives, letters written centuries apart share the same coded phrases. The light never dies. In the tombs of kings and merchants alike, small red crosses are etched discreetly on the inner stones, invisible unless the walls crumble. It's as if the Brotherhood left breadcrumbs through time, ensuring that those who seek would always find a trace. And maybe that's all they wanted, not to rule again, but to remind us that knowledge has a cost, and that truth, once found, must be protected. Every legend ends with a question. The Templar story is no different. Did they hide the Holy Grail? Did they discover a secret that could shatter faith itself? Or were they simply men dreamers who tried to bridge heaven and earth and paid the price for daring too much? The truth, like the Grail, may never be found. But the search defines us. Because somewhere in that search, in our hunger to uncover, to know, to believe, we carry their spirit forward. We too become knights in a world that no longer believes in sanctity, still fighting invisible wars between ignorance and illumination. And that, perhaps, is the truest legacy of all. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world forgets to pray, listen closely. Somewhere a bell tolls without hands. Somewhere a cross gleams faintly beneath the dust, and somewhere beneath centuries of silence, an ancient vow is whispered again. We are the guardians of what must never be lost. The Brotherhood endures, not as warriors, not as priests, but as memory itself, the eternal witness of mankind's rise and fall. And though their temples crumble and their names fade from scripture, the fire they lit still burns unseen, eternal, waiting.